It's a late start. Oh, we have all kinds of people online with us this morning. No surprise there. According to my my little thing here, Dan Demarest is online with us this morning. So finally, Dan will learn a thing or two. That's right. I especially like teasing people who can't respond. So we've been talking about the feeding of the 5,000, and last week we looked at the three synoptic gospel accounts. I just want to very quickly, and I mean this very quickly, run through some of the points that we looked at last week. 6 points from Matthew, 5 points from Mark, and 3 points from Luke. And then we'll jump into the John account, which sort of brings it all together, if you will. In the Matthew account, in Matthew 14, you don't have to go there, although you can if you like. It talks about how they get in the ship and go to a solitary place after they hear about that John the Baptist has been killed. We're going to talk a little bit more about that news in just a few minutes. It mentions that Jesus has compassion on them, and it says that he healed their sick. And it is kind of remarkable. Not remarkable, it's the Lord Jesus Christ. They had compassion on him. He's trying to get away to a solitary place, and he leaves a bunch of people there on the shore and gets in a boat and heads north, and gets north, and there are all the people. And so he recognizes, that these people are desperate. We talked about the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes and the symbolism of the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. 5 loaves representing grace. The 2 fishes representing, Jim pointed out the possibility of representing both Jews and Gentiles, which is something we're going to get into a little bit this morning, Lord willing. But it also represents the fact that he had just sent out the 12. And he sent them out 2 by 2 to preach the gospel. So if you think about it, they're preaching truth. They're healing, but they're also preaching truth. So you've got the 5 loaves, which represent grace, and you've got the 2 fish, which represents truth. So there's that ongoing theme of the Gospel of John of grace and truth right in the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. It mentions that he blesses and then breaks the loaves. And that's representative of himself breaking his body. And we'll talk a little bit more about that this morning with the information that John gives us. The feeding of the 5,000 is basically the entire atonement happening in a capsule. It's the whole atonement story in a capsule. And we mentioned that they gather up 12 baskets of fragments, which is mentioned in every gospel, that they gather up 12 baskets of fragments. The word fragments is specifically mentioned because that is, what's the 12 fragments of baskets represent? The broken redeemed is what that represents. And so the 5,000 represent the broken redeemed. Now they weren't the broken redeemed, they're representative of them because they rejected Jesus, which we'll learn later on in the Gospel of John. And in each case it mentions that they had eaten were about 5,000, and specifically in Matthew he mentions 5,000 men besides women and children. And we talked about who's got a calculator on them. I want somebody to figure out some math for me. Nate, you got a calculator on you? On your phone? So keep it on you, and when we get to a minute, I'm going to have you do some math for us. Just a curious math. There we go. In Mark, the 4 points of Mark, it's in Mark where he mentions that it's after the 12 come back. Jesus had sent out the 12 to heal and to preach, and right after they come back, Jesus says, why don't we go to a solitary place and rest? Now, it doesn't make the other one incorrect. It means there was more than one reason why they got in that boat. It mentions, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, it mentions that in Mark that one of the reasons they got in the boat to go is because they had no space, because there were so many people surrounding them that they couldn't even stop and eat. And of course, that becomes a big theme, needless to say, right down the road. It mentions in Mark that Jesus had compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Aminid, he began to teach many of them. And so in Matthew it mentions he heals them, and then in Mark it mentions he teaches them. And we're going to take another look at this idea of why they were like sheep without a shepherd. That's going to be one of our major considerations today in just a couple minutes. In Mark it mentions that he had them sit down in company. They sat down in companies with hundreds and fifties. So we were talking about how did they manage to count the 5,000. A couple people came up to me afterwards and said, maybe one of the ways they were able to do it is maybe the women and children didn't sit with the men. And so it was easier to count the men. Remember I was talking about how, it's hard to count heads when you've got a mixture of heads. But a couple of people suggested that maybe the women sat away. And I can tell you, I've been to kosher weddings, and in kosher weddings, the women sit on one side and the men sit on the other side. I've also been to kosher Passovers, and they don't sit separate. So, now why do I say Passover? We'll talk about that in a minute. And then the 8 of the loaves, Mark says, were about 5,000. And 4 points from Luke. Luke concurs with Mark as far as the reason they got in the boat was because Jesus wanted to take the disciples to a solitary place to rest after they'd been out preaching the gospel and healing the sick. Now Luke mentions that they traveled to a solitary place called Bethsaida. And Bethsaida means house of fish. And that's going to be an interesting point when we look at one of the lessons coming up. But they traveled to Bethsaida, to this place up north in the northeast of the Sea of Galilee, a place called Bethsaida, outside Palestine. And number 4, about 5,000 men. Jesus told them to sit down in 50s. They sat down in 50s and 100. Jesus blessed and brake, just like he did in the other synoptic gospels. They ate and were filled, just like they did in the other 3 gospels. And there are 12 baskets of fragments, just like it is in all 4 gospels. So there is a run-through of what we covered last week as far as how the different accounts give you a little piece and a little piece and a little piece. And now what John is going to do is he's going to wrap it all together and say this is really, in the end, what, in many respects, what it was all about. Not that these guys were wrong, just adding to it and completing the story. And remember, we mentioned that the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle that's mentioned in all 4 Gospels. Some people refused to believe me on that, as you noticed, and they were proved wrong. Why? Because Jim is always right. This is the rule of thumb. Okay, I want to talk about this for a minute, about this idea of he saw that they were like sheep without a shepherd. And what it was like to live in Palestine at the time of Christ, and what it meant that the news came around that John the Baptist had been beheaded. So Jesus got the news, but Jesus wouldn't have been the only one that got the news. Everybody would have gotten the news. And so what did it mean? Well, I want you to think about what it was like to live as a Jew in Israel at this time, or even a Gentile if you weren't a Roman. You had absolutely no political or law power of any kind. And there's no better example of that than John, right? John had no power. So he calls Herod out for killing his brother and marrying his wife, and Herod arrests him. He's got no legal recourse to arrest him, but he doesn't need a legal recourse to arrest him, right? And then when the daughter dances and says, I want his head, he gets his head cut off because he's got no way to stop that from happening. And that's part of what it was to live in Palestine as a Jew. Paul, as a Roman, could appeal onto Caesar. The everyday Jew living in Palestine couldn't go and appeal onto Caesar or really appeal onto anybody. You know, you lived under the political oppression of the Romans and under the political oppression of the people that the Romans put in power, whether that was Pontius Pilate or Herod or any of the others that he put in power. You basically lived under their rule, and they could do to you whatever they wanted to do. So it was an oppressive political situation. It was an oppressive economic situation, right? Because the taxpayers could extract as much money out of you as they could get out of you. And it's not like you could stop and say, hey, this isn't fair, let me go speak to somebody else, right? You didn't have that kind of recourse. So you had economic repression. You had religious repression, right? Because you could go to the temple and they could say to you, that's going to, the selling of the money changers, that's going to cost you this instead of that, and there's nothing anybody could do about it. Except the Lord Jesus Christ, who comes in and tips over the tables of the money changers. So you really had no religious power either. You had the Sadducees as part of your religious power, and they were just money grabbers. That's all they really did. You had the Pharisees, who lived sanctimonious lives, but they were perfectly willing to tell you that they were holier than you. And so you had really nobody to turn to, nobody of integrity, nobody of sincerity that you could turn to and say, now that person is somebody that we can believe in. except for one guy. And that one guy was a guy named John, the son of Zacchaeus, who was a Levite, and yet he's living out in the wilderness. He's gaining nothing by living there. He's wearing a camel coat, and he's eating wild bugs and honey. And he's saying to everybody, you know what? You're all in the same boat. You're all a bunch of sinners. And he's willing to say it to the Pharisees. He's willing to say it to the centurions, right? What's he say to the centurions? Don't oppress the people. What's he say to the taxpayers? Don't extract extra money. What's he saying to Herod? You can't kill your brother and marry your wife. He's the one guy of anybody that they could look at and say, there's a guy who is sincere in what he's doing. And there's a guy who's willing to stand up to the political society around them and to religious society around them. And what happened to him? He gets his head cut off. Now, there were these other guys. There were these zealots around. But what power do they have? They'd create a revolt, and they would just be obliterated, right? And it'd all be crucified, and probably part of their family would be crucified. And the Jewish religion and the Jewish perspective was not this sort of warrior perspective. It wasn't that kind of society. So even they didn't really fit in with the general theme of what the people needed and what the people wanted. And there hadn't been any word for 500 years until John came. So there was silence as far as prophecy. All you really had was learned men who just rambled on about nothing. And that's not me saying that. That's the Scripture saying that, because the Scripture speaks about Jesus was, here's a guy who spoke with authority. Right? And what they meant by spoke with authority is he actually spoke from the Bible. And he actually quoted from the Bible, and he actually showed his points from the Bible. The scribes and the Pharisees just had all these traditions and all these... And if you want to know what it's like, just read an article today. It really hasn't changed. That's one of the reasons that we know what the society is like, because in many respects it really hasn't changed. So if you ever get the Jerusalem Post, there's an article at the back. There used to be there. I haven't got it in a number of years. But there used to be a rabbi article in the back of the Jerusalem Post, and it was a one-page article about law and that kind of stuff. It was absolutely unintelligible. I read like 3 of them, and I was like, I have no idea what they're talking about. And that's the way it was in Israel at the time. You had these expositors and all these people rambling on and on and on and on, and nobody really knew what they were saying. And so you were like a sheep without a shepherd. Unless you were studying your Bible. And if you were studying your Bible, which most of the people probably were not, some were, Nathaniel certainly was, many others certainly were, then you really had no hope. You really had, what you didn't have is you had no power. You had no ability to either stand up for yourself or to stand up for anybody else. And so you just went day by day thinking, I have no power. There is no authority. There is nothing. Except along comes this guy, and he's a nobody from Nazareth. And it seems like he had some kind of power. In fact, he has a power John didn't have. John didn't heal the sick, right? John spoke strong words, and John looked like a prophet, and they believed he was a prophet, but he didn't have any power. He didn't have any authority, and Herod was perfectly willing to prove that by cutting off his head. But this guy seems to be able to heal the sick. Now that's a power. That's a divine power. And so obviously they look like sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus recognized that because they were in desperate need of a shepherd. But the way a shepherd works is you follow the shepherd, right? Or the shepherd leads you. It's interesting, I guess in different places the shepherd either walks in front or walks in back, and depending upon but either way, the shepherd's the one doing the leading. But maybe you want to have a shepherd, but you want to lead the shepherd. And obviously that's part of what happens when we get to John's gospel. Any questions or comments before we shift over to the Gospel of John, chapter 6? So open up your Bibles to John chapter 6. And let's see what John tells us different than what the others tell us. John chapter 6, verse 1. After these things, stop. After what things? Now, the natural inclination is you have 2 things, right? You have the 12 coming back, or you have John the Baptist being killed. But actually, neither of those are mentioned in the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, what you have is the story in John chapter 5 of the feeding of the impotent man. Now, I don't know if any of you ever heard that story before. We've only covered it 15 times in this class. But that's what John is talking about specifically. And there's two things to recognize what John is trying to get across by saying after these things. I'm not saying that the other things didn't happen. That's not my point. It's in the theme of John. John wants you to recognize that there's a transition from what happens in John chapter 5 at the feast of, what was the feast that the impotent man was healed at? Josh? Nope. Pentecost. Thank you very much, Butch. Somebody listening in class. Pentecost. Dan Demers wouldn't have got that right. Pentecost. At the transition between what happens at Pentecost and what happens in John chapter 6. And what happens at Pentecost, he's down in Jerusalem. He's inside the temple area. He heals the impotent man. And he heals the impotent man on what day of the week? The Sabbath. Right. And he's not crucified, but he's obliterated for it. They want to kill him because he healed on the Sabbath down in Jerusalem. So Jesus gives him a speech. And he says, I'm going to paraphrase the speech because we don't want to look at it again, but basically he says, this is what he says. He says, look, I just do what my Father does because my Father has life. And then my Father has given me the power and authority of life. And he says, if you don't like what I say, you ought to believe me for what I do. Right? Because healing of the impotent man is a power. Remember we talked about the fact that the man gets healed. He's been 38 years as an impotent man, and all the Pharisees can say to him is, you shouldn't be carrying your bed on the Sabbath day. He said there's something wrong with that mentality. Right? And Jesus says, if I'm healing on the Sabbath day, then I must have power. I have power because you can see it because I healed the guy. But I must have authority. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to heal on the Sabbath day. That's the message he gives them down in Jerusalem, right? And it says the Jews wanted to kill him for it. Because that is in complete contrast to what they want to believe. Because what they want to believe is, if you do the right thing, you'll be okay. And give me something to do, just like who was the Syrian, Naaman the Syrian. Just give me something to do, and I'll do it. But in this case, it's about grace and truth. And grace is not something you can do, it's something he can do. Does that make sense? Yeah? Good. So that's the message, really, of John chapter 5. And the important thing is he's down in Jerusalem, and he's rejected by the Jews because he heals on the Sabbath day and says to him, if I have a power, I must have authority. Does that make sense? Okay. Absolutely. How could you do the wrong thing with the power of God? Yep. So that's why he starts off by saying, after these things. Those are the things he wants you to key on. And then he says this. Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Any questions on that? Any question pop out to you when you read that? Anybody? Josh, you got a question? Tiberias? Okay, good question. Why does he mention both? First of all, one of the interesting things is in the other three synoptic gospels, it never mentions that he's crossing the Sea of Galilee. We know he is because we know where he was and we know where he went, but it just mentions that he gets in a boat and crosses and goes north to a solitary place. It's only actually in John's gospel that he mentions the Sea of Galilee. But why do we need to be told both names? It's not like you would say the Sea of Galilee and I would go, now which one is the Sea of Galilee? Oh, the Sea of Tiberias? Oh, okay, now I know what you're talking about. Why does he tell us both? Any thoughts why he gives us the name of both? Just wanted to give us, just wanted you to know that that's the other name for it? That doesn't really have any meaning, does it? And remember, there's no useless words. It's always there for a reason. So think about it for a second. Why would he tell us both the Sea of Galilee, who would that be speaking to, and the Sea of Tiberias, who would that be speaking to? Jews and Gentiles, absolutely. Sea of Galilee was what the Jews called the sea. Sea of Tiberias is what the Romans or the non-Jews called the sea. And so what's that telling us? Because the very next word is, and a great multitude followed him. Therefore, what is he telling us by he mentions the fact that he went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. They were both there. You had both Jews and Gentiles, which wasn't, it would be very unusual down in Judea, down in Jerusalem. Down in Jerusalem was probably 99% Jews. I'm sure there were other Gentiles there. The Roman soldiers were there. But for the most part, in Judea, you had Jews. In Galilee, which is also known as Galilee of the Gentiles, you had a mixed breed of Jews and Gentiles. And whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, if you see somebody that can heal the sick, right? By the way, if you're a Jew or a Gentile, you're living in the same oppressive society, right? If you're not a Roman. It's not like just because you're not a Jew, you're not going to be, persecuted or, overcharged by the tax collectors, or if you say something against Herod, he's not going to cut your head off. I mean, you're living in the same situation. You just have a different religion. So they're both there. Okay? So this group that follows to the north is full of both Jews and Gentiles. Okay, so keep that in mind too, because when we consider things like whether or not they separate, we're not going to consider that much because it's only a side question. Whether they separated the men and the women, the Gentiles wouldn't have separated the men and the women. That was a religious practice of the Jews. So the Gentiles wouldn't have done that, just as an aside. Okay. And he went up unto a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. Well, that's a new twist to our story. We've never been told that in the Synoptic Gospels, that this was taking place right at the point of the Passover. So right at the point of the Passover, first of all, they're up in Galilee. This whole group is up in Galilee. By this time, that word nigh means it's like just about to happen. So it's right at the point of the Passover, and yet these 5,000 people are all up in Galilee. Where do you go for Passover? You go to Jerusalem, right? They don't go to Jerusalem. Why don't they go to Jerusalem? Because there's a guy healing in Galilee. And they're like a sheep without a shepherd. And yeah, there's a bunch of shepherds, if you want to call them, down in Jerusalem, but nobody down there is healing the sick. And nobody down there has my concerns in mind. And so they're up here at the Passover. And it says a Passover, a feast of the Jews. Well, why is it mentioned that it's a feast of the Jews? Don't the Jews know Passover is a feast of the Jews? So why does he say a feast of the Jews? Well, there's Gentiles there. So it's an explanation. This is a Jewish feast. And so Jesus is going to feed 5,000 people at the Passover, at the point of the Passover. Why would Jesus feed 5,000 people at the point of the Passover? Because he is the Passover. That's what he is. He is the Passover. Like I say, this is the entire atonement happening before us. He breaks the bread. Why does he break the bread? Because he's going to offer up his body as a sacrifice in the end. In the true Passover, which is happening either 1 or 2 years later. It's really hard to determine whether or not, this is definitely the second Passover, or whether or not there were 4 Passovers or 3 Passovers. Because he lived 3.5 years, right? Or he lived 33.5 years. But, he ministered for 3.5 years. But this is probably either 2/3 of the way through his ministry or right smack in the middle of his ministry. And here he is at the Passover, and he's going to feed the 5,000. And the lesson of the 5,000 is, what does the atonement really mean? That's the true lesson, okay? And the true lesson, obviously, is in the 12 baskets of broken fragments. It's in the broken individual that puts on Christ. I hope all that makes sense. Okay, let's continue. And when Jesus lifted up his eyes and saw a great multitude come unto him, he saith unto Philip, Whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? So this is obviously, again, we've heard this before, but in the other accounts, the disciples come to Jesus and say, send these people away because we don't have enough food to feed them. And in this case, it says Jesus looks up and says to Philip, how are we going to feed these people? Well, again, the accounts can't conflict. So clearly what happened is they came to him and said, how are we going to feed this people? And Jesus looks up and sees Philip and says, Philip, how are we going to feed these people? And Philip says, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, and every one of them to take a little. You got your calculator going? Okay, get ready for this. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, saith unto him, There is a lad here, which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? So in the other accounts, what does it say about this? In this account, it says, we got this kid here. Here he is. That's the very kid, by the way. There he is. I don't know how they took the picture. I mean, it's just it's such a lifelike rendition. But so why do the other Gospels say we have 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and John says this kid has 5 loaves and 2 fishes? Are they saying in the other Gospels, well, we're just going to take this kid's 5 loaves and 2 fishes? He's got them, but we have them. Why do you suppose that is? That the other Gospels would say we have 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and in John's Gospel it says, well, there's a kid here who's got 5, and there's the 2 fishes right there with we're going to assume 5 loaves underneath. Any thoughts why that would be? Remember back in Mark's Gospel we said they didn't even have a chance to eat, right? How did they eat? We're talking about Jesus and the 12. How did they eat? Any ideas how they ate? They're in a solitary place themselves, right? They say, get these people out of here because there's no way for us to feed them. But they don't say, we got to go to town and get some food as well. So generally speaking, how did they eat? There were women that provided for them. You see, the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes are the food that was supposed to be provided for them. And the lad is the one carrying the food. He's carrying the food that is their provision so that they can eat, the 13 of them. Does that make sense? Okay, so here's the math. If 5 loaves and 2 fishes feeds 13, what would it take to feed 5,000? We won't even talk about the women and children. So how would we figure that out? If 5 loaves and 2 fish feed 13, how many loaves and fish do you need to feed 5,000? Divide 5,000 by 13 and then multiply by? I would say 5. I would do them separate. So divide 5,000 by 13. So you'd need 1,923 loaves of bread. How many fish would you need? You did it in your head? If you did it, 768 fish. So you need, what is it, 1,800? What is it, 1,300 loaves of bread and 700 fish to feed the 5,000 men, besides the women and children, and we're not even taking the 13 into account. Well, they were already fed, I suppose. Now, obviously, the reason I bring that up is, obviously, they didn't have, 1,300 loaves of bread lying around, or how many fish was it? 700 fish? 700 and something? 768 fish. And if they did, you'd see it. It would be there, right? So as this miracle starts to occur, it obviously starts to dawn in everybody something serious is going on, right? So let's pick up on that for a minute. And Jesus said, make the men to sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. And Jesus, now notice this. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were set down, and likewise to the fishes as much as they would. What's different between John's gospel and the others? When he sat down, he took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, the other gospels say blessed, but it's probably pretty much the same thing. It might even be the same word, who knows? He distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were sat down, and likewise the fishes as much as they would. Anybody see a difference there? He doesn't break the loaves. In all 3 other Gospels, he breaks the loaves. In this one, it says he gives thanks and then he passes it out. Now, obviously, he breaks the loaves. So why doesn't John pick up on the fact that he doesn't break the loaves? And yet all 3 others make a point of pointing out that he breaks the loaves. And yet John does not. Because John is the gospel of the Spirit. And the Spirit is God. And so Jesus definitely gave his flesh. His flesh was broken on our behalf. But the Spirit by which he lived was never broken. And that Spirit was his obedience to his Father. And so John doesn't say he breaks the loaves. And yet when we get to the fragments, it's still fragments. Because our bodies still need to be broken, or our will still needs to be broken. And when they were filled, he said unto his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Therefore they gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves. It's the first time we're told barley, by the way. It says the kid had 5 barley loaves, and then it's repeated again that it's barley loaves. Why does it tell us barley loaves, by the way? That's a tough question. But why does it say barley loaves? Any ideas? When were the barley loaves important? At the Feast of Pentecost. Feast of Pentecost is when you had the barley harvest. The barley harvest was the first harvest. And this is a harvest, but this is the first harvest. The second harvest is the harvest that happens at the end. Whoops, I just lost my page. So John picks up on the fact that it's barley loaves, just a minor point. Well, it might be a major point, but as far as I'm concerned, it's a minor point. He remained over them that had eaten. And those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, this is of a truth that prophet should come into the world. So think about it again. You're sitting in this crowd, and you're there following Jesus. And I think I have a picture that fits. Let me see. Yeah, okay. So you've got this mass of people, okay? And they're following Jesus, 5,000 people. And Jesus says, tell them to sit down. And, you're way over, here's Butch way over here. I mean, clearly, right? So he doesn't know what's going on. So the disciples go through the crowd and say, everybody sit down, sit down, sit down. Sit down in 50s. Count out 50, you count out 50 over here. You got 100, that's okay. Sit down in groups, sit down, everybody sits down. And then Jesus is way over here, and he breaks bread, and he blesses it, and he starts to pass out. Not pass out the food. And you start to see the disciples go around, and the disciples start passing food over here, and those people start eating. And then he passes the food over here, and 12 goes on over here, and over here, and over here, and over here. And everybody starts to eat. And you start looking around, and you start seeing all these people are eating. They're all eating bread. They're all eating fish. Whoa. Right? You got to be kidding. A miracle is happening right before our eyes. A remarkable presentation of power. And nobody misses it. I don't care if you're the most insignificant, you're the most oblivious person in the room or on the hill, you can't miss the fact that there's not, 1,800 loaves of bread and 700 fish somewhere behind him that they're just continuing to pass out and pass out, pass out. That's not happening. This is a true, bona fide, remarkable miracle happening before your eyes. And you're a part of it. And they all look around and they start talking to themselves and they start saying, of a truth, this must be the prophet that's supposed to come. Not ready to say the Christ, but this must be the prophet that's ready to come. Now I'm going to show you 2 verses we didn't look at before. Any comments or thoughts on that? At the end of the story of the feeding of the 5,000, Matthew makes a point and Mark makes a point. Luke actually doesn't make this point. John's going to pick up on it, so we want to make sure rather than jump back. Matthew says this, right at the end of the feeding of the 5,000, he's just fed them. He says, and straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship and to go before him onto the other side while he sent the multitude away. Okay? So literally, as they finish passing out the food and as everybody's finishing to eat, it says Jesus grabbed his 12 disciples. John, me, Matthew, you, Peter, you, Simon, come with me, come with me, come with me, come with me, come with me. We'll be going. Come with me, come with me. Takes them down to the boat. Said, get in the boat. Get in the boat, go across. What are you going to do? I'm going to get rid of the 12. You get in the boat, you go. You go right now, you go right now. Go. In, go. What? In, go. Out, gone. Both of them. Mark, and straightway he constrained his disciples. That constraint is like, you're going. This is not, hey, I think you guys need to. No, you're going. You're gone. You're out of here. He constrained his disciples to get into the ship, onto the other side, onto Bethsaida. So that's interesting, isn't it? Because where are they? They're in Bethsaida. And he tells them to get in the boat And he sends them to Bethsaida. How is that possible? Well, he told them just to take the boat out 500 yards and come back? How is it possible he sent them to Bethsaida when they're in Bethsaida? Any thoughts? There's 2 Bethsaidas, right? You can tell somebody in Springfield, Vermont to go to Springfield. It just means go to Springfield, Massachusetts. There's 2 of them. There's one up in the northeast, and there's one down in the southwest of the Sea of Galilee. So he sends them to Bethsaida. So he sends them from the house of fish to the house of fish. Well, he sent away the people. Okay, so keep that in mind. Let's go back to John. So for some reason, Jesus is like, you get in that boat and you get out of here. Why? Well, John's going to explain to us why. And I wish I held my page. Okay, so verse 14 again says, and those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, this is of a truth that prophet who should to come. Oh, before we go to the next verse, I want to ask another question. And I asked this question before. And let's see, and maybe it's a minor point, maybe it's a major point. Maybe we can figure that out as we go along. What's missing in the feeding of the 5,000? Remember I said that either last week or the week before. There's something missing in the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Anybody see what it is? There's something really important not there. Turn over for 1 second. Keep your finger in John chapter 6 and turn over to Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7, the very next thing after the feeding of the 5,000. And after I think he also crosses the sea, right? Yeah, he walks on the sea. The very next thing, chapter 7, it says, then came together, verse 1, then came together unto him the Pharisees and certain of the scribes which came from Jerusalem. And when they saw the disciples eat bread with defiled, that is to say, with unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft, eat not, holding the traditions of the elders. So what's missing at the feeding of the 5,000? Yeah, and there's no water, right? There's no water. It's not like everybody then ran down to the Sea of Galilee and dipped their hands in the water. There's no water. They didn't wash their hands. And yet you certainly had Gentiles who probably wouldn't have, but you also had many Jews. And it's the time of the Passover. And they didn't wash their hands. Why not? Well, water wasn't provided, but still, hey, all right, then I guess I can't eat. Right? It says right there, many Jews will not eat unless they often wash their hands. And by the way, I know you guys have heard the story about me working on the Passover. They're not kidding. They will not go near the food unless they put water on their hands. Now, again, this is not washing. This is not soap and water. This is literally just a ceremonial. They take the water, they dump it on their hands, and then they dry their hands off. Yeah, maybe, in a sense, if you think about the fact that we're all unclean. Remember, this is the atonement taking place before your eyes. And what does Jesus do with the atonement? He nails all those laws to the cross. And this is the completed atonement because you have the 12 baskets of fragments. Remember, 12 represents government. It represents authority. It represents Christ in charge. And so it's the completion of the entire atonement in the feeding of the 5,000. Do we wash our hands? And yet we're Jews in the Spirit because all that's been nailed to the wall. So you don't need the water. They didn't need the water anyway. But it's not about following law. It's about following Jesus. And all this happens in the feeding of the 5,000. That's how powerful a story this really is. Now, the people aren't going to get it. But there's going to be many Jews there that are going to be wishing back and forth. We didn't wash our hands. We didn't wash our hands. What difference does it make? We didn't provide the food. The food came from 5 loaves and 2 fishes way up there on the hill. And the guy way up there on the hill feeding 5,000 people is not saying, hey, go wash your hands. What are you, a pig? Because it doesn't matter. Because the thing that makes you unclean is your own sins. If you turn and walk away, which they're about to do. What time do we have, by the way? Oh my gosh, is it almost 10:30? Oh, you know what? We started 15 minutes late. All right. What we're going to do starting next week, Lord willing. Actually, I think next week might be First Principles. Is next week First Principles? Yeah. Okay. You got it, Butch? No. Okay. Well, whether next week or the week afterwards, we'll start picking up on, just take a look at verse 7. And he called the 12 and began to send them forth two by two. Oh, no, that's not the verse I want. Hold on. Sorry. Verse 45. No, that's the problem. I'm in Mark. Sorry. Verse 15 of John chapter 6. And when Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again into a mountain place. And he's at this point he said, so we're going to see what that means, that it says they perceive and they decide. Jesus perceives. How did he perceive it? That they were going to take him by force. And what does that mean, that they were going to grab him by force and force him to go to Jerusalem to become king? Why would they do it? And what's wrong with it? And that's what we'll talk about, Lord willing, next time. All right?